What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be going over yet another tier list, but this time it's not the meta deck tier list. It is in regards to a staples tier list, or any sort of non-engine cards that we should be playing in the meta. There's a lot to choose from, so it's going to be a rather long video, but I know there's a fair amount of cards I think are either under or overrated that I feel are worth discussing. So yeah, I hope this is something that's going to be informative for you guys. Please let me know down below if you enjoy these type of videos and what else you would like to see in the future. Before I continue, go check out tsx1.com and use the code potato10 for 10% off on your sleeves. Again, great sleeves, the ones I use. And yeah, let's get into the tier list. Okay, so this is everything that I've kind of pulled out for the tier list right now. There maybe are other options I don't consider. I may have just forgotten, so if there are any that I've forgotten, just feel free to let me know down below, but I probably covered everything that's super relevant here. And I guess I'll just start. Call by the Grave is one that I've been pretty strongly advocating against in terms of its playability. I think it typically sucks going second in many matchups. I think that is true this format still as well. And I only really like this card in a deck when that is true, and the fact that it can be used going second in an effective manner. Even with Maxi in the format, I still wasn't playing this in my decks just because it doesn't do anything going second. In this format, my opinion should be pretty clear. I don't think it's very good. I think going second, it accomplishes almost nothing. You can hit a Yama, which could be relatively high value. That's it. On top of that, hand traps aren't that popular right now. Ash is really the only one this would hit. Maybe you're playing Rescue Ace or Brandon and you really want something to resolve through Ash, you have to play Call By, but it feels like a relatively big sacrifice, something that doesn't help you in many matchups. Isn't even that good of a defensive card, and isn't going to help you crack through fields either. So I'm putting this card in the not worth it section, which is probably the lowest it's ever been. I think there are many times where it's just average, but in this format specifically, it really feels like this card just isn't good. I guess bad into. Next up is Mistaken Arrest. This has been seeing a little bit of traction in some regional deck lists. The card is solid, so I'm gonna have it pop up right on screen here. If you're not sure what it is, pretty much just stop searching for the turn, akin to a Joel and Lockbird. It doesn't require them to search first, which can make the difference many times. And if you're looking for something that you can set when you go first to use as a floodgate that doesn't lose to Storm or evenly, like something like Anti-Spell does, then this card is pretty good. It also covers weaker matchups. If that weaker matchup is like Flu or even Cash, this is solid against. So the card is fine. However, I think with a rather wide meta, you have to be careful to make sure that your side deck doesn't have too many going first cards. I just think if you have too many going first cards in your side deck, then you don't actually have the tools to go second versus the plethora of decks you can play in the meta, because like you're preparing for at least 6 meta decks and a bunch of rogue decks you are likely to play against. You want to make sure you can actually aptly prepare, and I'm worried that too many going first cards is a pitfall with a lot of side strategies. You're going to see this list a lot. I tend to not favor cards that are only good going first. So Mistaken Arrest is kind of like that. Obviously it's not good in the main deck. We're really just talking about the side deck here going first, and even then I just think it's just average. I think there's merit to play it, but I don't think it's that good. Next up, Anti-Spell Fragrance. Again, another really strong, powerful trap. If there's a card I want banned, this is probably at the highest on my list. I cannot stand this card, and I just lost to it at Top Cut of Brazil in top 4. But I still don't think this card is that good. Again, it's a going first card, but even worse, it loses to Evenly Matched, which, although I tend to not be the biggest fan of, is relatively popular. And, you know, like, in most decks, there's not a way to protect it. Like, there aren't many negates right now. It's like purely Cash, Unchained, Rescue Ace. They don't really have a good way to protect this anti-spell. They can kind of maneuver around it a little bit, where Cash can put up a Baron sometimes, or the Cyber's version of Rescue Ace maybe can put up the negate with the Cyber's Deoworm, I think it's called. I don't like relying on that going first stuff again, and there are decks that can play through it. Like if you anti-spell versus Unchained, there's no guarantee they can't play. Also, as people start preparing more for anti-spell, it will become worse. People just saw it in PAX YCS winning deck list. You should expect it in more deck lists now. The stuff that's beating these decks like Unchained was now shift to more non-spell tools. So stuff like Jewess Worm, Marionette Might, Fenrir, Lava Golem, Evenly Matched, those cards, and then it just makes your anti-spell look ineffective. So this may be a bit of a shocker, but I just think this is average. It's probably the highest amount of average you can go, because this card will still win games for sure. But I just don't like it. And I'm going to be a little biased here because I really don't like playing this card. A lot of the time I don't like dedicating spots to going first that also then require my engine to already be functioning. But yeah, NSBell just average for now. Let's see if it kicks me in the ass and it costs me a match. NSBell. It cost me at a match at Vancouver again as well. Next up is Ash Blossom. So if you know me from talking on stream or deck profiles, you know I'm not typically the biggest fan of hand traps, and Ash Blossom I think is severely overrated. However, in this format, I am actually a huge fan of Ash Blossom. Despite the rise in thrusts and talents, I do like this card for its ability to brick many opponents, considering that I'd say maybe a quarter of all hands across every deck just loses to a single Ash Blossom. It also is just good to keep in hand as a disruption. If they clear with your field, all your interrupts there, having the Ash as the next layer can often close out the game. It's also very good versus the Chimera deck, which a lot of decks non-engine currently doesn't deal with that well, specifically Book of Moons. And then it's also good versus Rescue Ace, because you hit emergency and oftentimes that ends their turn more than 25% of the time, I'd say. So I think this deck, or this card, is kind of underappreciated right now. Obviously turning on Thrust and Ash is a little annoying, but on the contrary, this card can actually be used to safely play into Thrust. And if you continue seeing the trend where Thrust is more popular than Talents itself, then Ash may just be like a very good option. So I think this card is really good. You're gonna see I'm gonna reserve this for maybe 1 or 2 cards, but because this isn't perfect, it doesn't always do. Sometimes it does nothing. There's also a problem. But I do think it's good. Ugh. Next up is D-Barrier. So D-Barrier has been pretty popular for a while now in side decks. Again, it's not going to be a main deck card, but the main reason is you can hit Purely and the branded decks very effectively, ending their turn. And it's not weak to Storm or evenly with other decks. So I think this card is just fantastic at doing that. However, if your matchup is already good versus Purely because you're playing a lot of non-engine that covers that matchup, like I was at Brazil, then you don't really need it for Purely. If you're only looking for Chimera, I think there is a better card because Barrier doesn't do anything going second, really. That's Grave the Super Ancient Organism. I think this card is a little overrated. However, going first, it is obviously an extreme blowout with pretty much zero counterplay, which is why this card should probably be banned. But I don't think it's like insane. So I think it is strong in the right deck or matchup. I really would only play it in decks where I want to cover both Purely and Chimera. I think if you don't want to cover both and you're only trying to focus on the Chimera deck, because you feel confident as Purely, you should not be playing Barrier. But if both are a weak spot and you want the going first cards to combat them, this is how you do it. And I think that is justifiable for sure. And we'll have spot in several decks. And then obviously it also has the utility off of Thrust that makes it good even as a one of in decks where it may not be the card you need. Next up is Ghost Spell. This is a card that was pretty popular in side decks the last few months as it dealt with Labyrinth, but it seems to be pretty ineffective against everything else in the meta. So we got into the weird spot where it's never going to be in a main deck. It's just not good enough against any of the matchups. And it's, if you want to dedicate spots to something that is pretty much purely for Labyrinth, it was okay versus Runic decks, okay versus branded decks, but the new branded decks don't really care about the bell as much, and the new and the Runic decks are way less popular. So I think this card has fallen off a lot. I think even with Labyrinth getting a new bad matchup in Unchained, that matchup's going to fall off, making this even worse. So it's hard. Part of me wants to say, like, obviously in the right matchup it's fine, but I don't think this card is ever really worth putting in your side deck unless you have a really big glaring issue versus Labyrinth. I think right now it's just not the time to be playing Bell. And if you want something for Labyrinth, try find something with a little better overlap. We're getting a follow. That's pretty funny. Well, I'm not even live. I'm just recording. But find something better, like a Cosmic Cyclone maybe that covers multiple matchups a little bit better. Next up is Forbidden Chalice. So this one has not been seeing play for a while, but it could start seeing a little bit more of a comeback, specifically in the Unchained deck. Now, Unchained obviously is weak to Dweller, and while playing in Brazil, I didn't see it much. However, on the last couple weeks or so, I heard whispers of people starting to play Dweller again in Rescue Ace and in Kashtira with 2 Rise Hearts. So that's starting to happen. The adaptation from these Unchained players is going to be Effect Negation, However, I think citing an effect negation blind, if people aren't guaranteed doing that, is rather risky. It just trades worse than almost any other card in those matchups. So I'm still not the hugest fan. I'd rather find something with a little more overlap. I just think that Chalice isn't even that good of a going first card to set. And ultimately, it's just not worth it. If we continue to see Dweller being growing in popularity and becoming like an actual thing that Unchained is to worry about, then this might be the right card for Unchained, but as of right now, this card is not going near my deck. Next up is Change of Heart. This card is really strong. If you watch the top 4 feature match, which I posted as my last video, it is the card that won Pack that game. And it's very good against Kashtira. It's very good against Unchained. And then against other matchups as well, it still does fine just to clear the field, to give you bodies to link with. Maybe set up a Zeus play of your own. I think it's this very, very strong card, and not having the activation requirements of Talents gives it that edge that Talents doesn't have. And it means you can't really play around it as much, as you can see how I got punished. So I think this card is really good. I do think it obviously struggles going first. I mean, it does nothing. And when you play against, there are some decks where it's not fantastic against. One funny interaction is against Labyrinth. You can change a Labyrinth monster, and it actually becomes useful. But in other like scenarios, it's not. That being said, I think the card is really good and should be in most side decks. I just don't think it's good enough going first to really offer you a main deck spot. And while most of its matchup spread is good, I think it is still lacking. Next up is Contact C. I think this card is pretty bad. It sees play from time to time in very, very specific decks, but it's risky and always requires your opponent to be unprepared. Like in the Purely matchup, if they aren't playing generic Link 2s, this can just screw them over. That's a big if, and if they do play those cards, then you're kind of going to get wasted a card out of your hand, and wasted a potential tech slot. And I feel like, at least in this meta as well, that's the only thing I really wanted against. So I'd have to say this card is just rather useless. Very much not worth it. Unchained will make a Solar Rage or a Muckracker as well, a Griffin. They're very, very easy to deal with, and not a good card. Next up is Cosmic Cyclone. This card has been popping up quite a bit in a lot of matches, or a lot of deck results, and a lot of deck lists. And I think that's because people like it as a going first option against something like Unchained, something you can set and is still useful. You can also side in versus other matchups like Labyrinth to still give you back removal now that you're kind of giving less attention to that deck. And I can understand why they're doing that. However, I feel like you're kind of spreading it a little too thin. It's a fine interrupt, but you're playing into Storms and Evenlies, which are pretty prevalent in most side decks. And it may not always be doing enough versus Labyrinth. I think it is fine versus Labyrinth. I don't think the card is straight up garbage, but I always feel like there's just something else I'd rather have in its place. So from my perspective, this card is just average. It's very much playable, and it could be right, but I think the circumstances for it to be right are not that common. Next up, Crossout Designator. So this one is a card I've always hated. I just think for it to be good, you're going to play a lot of mirror matches, or you just have to play a lot of one of tech cards in your deck. But a lot of tech cards right now are not that much better than the next one. So there is a very real chance that you can play a bunch of 2-ofs or 1-ofs in your deck and it ends up being fine. It just still feels weird. I really think this card shines if you have glaring weaknesses to one specific card. And if that's the case, then it's like the only card that can protect you from it. That's when you have to play it. So we've seen it being played a lot in Branded and Purely because it stops Barrier, Ash, and the books. And I think those are really the only applications for it and the only places I'd want it. I have seen it popping up in Cash. I think that is the wrong place to put it. Cash, you just want more flexible non-engine that really bolsters your engine more. And I don't think Crossout really is the right thing. So I think this card is right in the right decker matchup. And it can be strong, and it can be very scary to see activated against you. But it is very specific for certain things. Alright, we got DD Crow here. This is one that has seen pretty much no play recently. However, I have seen some people start talking about it a little more as a countermeasure to Unchained. Reason being is you can just turn off the Surama, or you can get rid of the Yama from Grave to try crack through the field very easy, or a lot easier. I think this is just worse than Abyssal. I don't see why this is being talked about. Yes, you can maybe pick out the resources a little bit, but I don't know. This feels like you're dealing with a small piece of the problem. So you're committing a side deck spot to try do something when you could be just doing a lot more with that one side deck spot. And I don't know if this will really get there enough at the time. Reason to play this over Bestial is to have better matchup spread versus other stuff, but this card is still going to be terrible versus Kashtira. It's going to be pretty bad versus Rescue Ace as well. Versus Labyrinth, it's probably not very good either. I have to imagine it's not worth deciding in. Versus Chimera, it's fine, I guess. You hit the spell, or the Mirror Knight, and then I guess versus Purely, you have Black Cat. So, like, you do have a slightly better spread, but, like, all of those matchups, it just feels, not, like, exceedingly strong in any of them. And you don't want to have just your side deck full of cards that are just meh, unless you're really, really comfortable with your engine, like, carrying heavy of the, like, a lot of the weight. I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. I think this card is, like, really pushing the limits of average. I'd, like, lean towards not worth it, but I will understand why some people think it's worth it. It really, really need to cover several matchups. Next up is Daruma Cannon, a card that has been popular for a while now in Labyrinth decks, and a card that I cited as a thrust target in my Unchained deck. So my opinion should be pretty obvious here. I think it is pretty strong in the right decker matchup. It is pretty much exclusively for Kashtira. You can put it in other matchups as well, and you probably will, but it functions very similar to Books, which is okay. The real reason to have it, though, is when you get shifted versus Kashtira, you need to have a backup plan. And having this with Thrust as well as Books means you have a ton of ways to still make sure you live the shifter, then play properly on the following turn. And I think this applies to many, many decks that have problems with shifter. And this is one of the main techs we can use to keep Kash's win rate down from, ridiculously high. And for the spot of only one card in your deck, I think this is worth it. Assuming you're playing Thrust, but yeah. Next up is Deck Lockdown. This is a card we considered for the YCS. It is interesting because you play this going first, you finish your combo, you activate it. They can't use Purely cards, they can't use Unchained cards, they can't search with Cash cards, they can't use Emergency or search the Rescue Ace cards, they can't Welcome, they can't Big Welcome. This card just turns off everything. And I think that's, like, pretty enticing and interesting to look at. Obviously, however, it's weak to Storm and it's weak to Evenly and Duster. But this card might be good. It's a card I want to test more. I really haven't had the time to explore. I think I'd rather have this, though, than Anti-Spell. Also because it stops Thrust. I'm curious to see if anybody else brings it to the tournaments. I honestly don't know where I'd put it because I haven't explored it enough. I'm going to put it... I don't know where I'd put it. I don't know. This is a card I have a lot of faith in. I'm going to blindly put it here. And I don't know if this is right. But my intuition says this card is probably better than Anti-Spell right now. And it could be pretty much of a menace in the next format. It's weaker to Lightning Storm and Duster. But it, I think, is better versus just like natural engine. It's better versus Purely. And obviously it's like as equally good versus Evenly. So, or equally bad, I guess. But yeah, I think this card is worth considering and looking at. It may be good. What's cool if you have like Unchained Abomination with this is you can pop it yourself and then turn it off. I'm not sure if you'd ever need to do that, but just an application to think about. You can Rise Heart Banish it as well if you need to start playing again. But these are things I doubt would ever come up. Next up is Dark Hole. We saw it be very popular at the NAWCQ as a way to clear Kashtira fields and just deal with other stuff. Like the Runic decks as well weren't ending on Hugin or a way to summon Hugin, so this could clean up as well. And now people are playing it as a thrust target to trigger Unchained effects as well while clearing the field. I think the card is just average. I think if you're doing something like that, there's just better stuff to do. And while Thrust can get a lot of utility, I think the small edges you get by adding these extra utility pieces is not worth now cluttering your deck with a bunch of 1-ofs that are more situational. I think with Thrust, a lot of the time only 1 or 2 targets is all you're ever going to get anyways, or are going to be good enough anyways. And to try and like edge out a little bit better thrusts by making your main deck a lot more random doesn't feel favorable to me. Next up is Dark Ruler No More, a card that I've been a fan of for a while and I think is relatively strong. For surprisingly, this is like one of the biggest formats where it's not good. You can hit Griffin stuff, you can hit Caesar, you can hit Rage, you can hit the Cash Field. Sometimes you can hit some stuff versus Rescue Ace. But overall, this card is not very good in the current meta. A lot of interruptions are being held through back row right now, or just through a small field plus follow-up. And Dark Ruler guarantees them another turn, so it takes that threat off immediately. And then we'll leave up all the back row interrupts as well. So a lot of decks will still kind of have you. And then this won't really deal with Noir either most of the time. Sometimes it does if they stand by phase, Eep, and they only have 4 materials. But it's an if, and you don't like making those judgment calls unless you have to. So I think this card is pretty bad right now, which sucks. I think this card is really cool. But yeah, it just has not a good matchup spread. Next up is Roland Lockbird, a card that always goes in and out of popularity. It's very cyclical. We saw a little bit of an uptick in the last few weeks, and now it's kind of dropped off a bit. I do not think this card is very good right now. I think it is pretty bad versus Unchained. I think it is below average versus Kashtira. It can high roll them, but it really doesn't do it that often. I think it's solid versus Chimera. It's horrible versus Labyrinth. It's okay versus Rescue Ace. It's really just okay. Versus Purely, it's okay. They can usually play around it fairly easily. And I think that just leaves his card unfavorable. It would really just be from Vanadium decks, and I don't think those are popular enough to dedicate spots to. And this may be a bold opinion, but I think this card is not worth it. There's nothing I really want this for right now. And usually this card at least always has good side deck coverage, but I really don't think that's even the case right now. Next up, Forbidden Droplet. Okay, so Droplet again, similar to Chalice, can be used to deal with Dweller, but you could maybe do shenanigans where you ditch spells or traps to cut off ways to protect the Dweller, which could be useful. But obviously this is bad into Shifter. It's bad into Rise Heart, which means your matchup spread with this card is automatically going to be worse as well. I think this card can be okay in some matchups, but main trend we're seeing here is that a lot of the interruptions aren't focused around the field. So effect negation cards aren't in their element right now. They seem to be typically below average. And I think that stands true with the Droplet, and it's just not worth it. If you have a deck with Graveyard Advantage, maybe it sees a little more play, but right now, at least with the meta decks as well, you don't really want to be discarding stuff. So I think this card is firmly in the not worth it position right now, which is strange because it's a good card. And there will be a meta where this card is fantastic again, absolutely. Just right now, not it. I'm going to talk about the Bestials next. I did separate them. I think Magnamut is just average. The main 6 decks that I've talked about, Bestials are fine against them for the most part. Specifically Magnamut, let's talk about. So if you were playing against the Unchained deck and they go for the Griffin line with Muckracker, this Bestial can be insane. If you make if they make Muckracker and then they target the Yama and then you Bestial it, that's obviously insane. If you go Magnamut there, they're in a really, really rough spot. However, if they aren't going for that line and they just make the Caesar, say you had the foresight to Magnamut before and they put the Yama in grave first, you order the Yama, but now the card you're searching off Magnamut, usually Druis Worm, is dead to the Caesar, or you can force it out, which only does you so much if that's like the one non-engine card you've been able to put in. And then I think the Bestials are just okay versus Labyrinth. I'd put them in if you have them, I guess, but they're not fantastic. Usually better than like books, but they're not going to solo the game by themselves like an Ash or a Bell might. And they're okay with the Chimeras because they hit the Sword Knight, but they really don't deal with the main problem. They kind of just help a little bit. I think Bestial is kind of not the greatest. However, I think Druis Worm is actually really good because it still has that coverage into being okay into those other matchups. But what it also does is you don't get locked up by the Caesar. So where the Magnamut in the one position against Unchained would have searched the Druis Worm and been stuck in your hand. Now if the Druis Worm is on the field, you can attack the Caesar and kill it. And the Yama is gone, so a lot of their grind is gone as well. and the Caesar is gone, and now they just have the trap and the rage to deal with without the Yama being there. And that's pretty strong for one card to deal with the Unchained field, given that the deck has been pretty resilient to a lot of non-engine. So I think if there is a bestial that's better in that matchup, it's Juice Worm. The point where I'd consider playing just 3 Juice Worm over any Magnemutes. I think Magnemut's actually worse rarely here, just because you don't want to get the Magnemut to get locked out of the game. That being said, Magnemut's still fine. I think it's probably one of the strongest cards here that is just average, but if you have to be picky with your side deck space, you don't want to play 6 Bestials, I'd be leaning towards the Juice over this. If you want more than 3 Bestials, then I guess this would be the next best one, obviously, and it's still good. I just really like Juice Worm right now. Next up is Book of Eclipse. I think this card is phenomenal right now. I think when you go first, most decks will struggle to play against this card, and when you go second, it still really contributes to breaking the field. Even if it just deals with the Caesar, that's fine. It helps you play through impermanent effect negator effects. It helps you play through Nib and Unchained, because you can set your cards face down to avoid being nibbed, and then pop them off to continue going. You can use it to book the Kashtira cards going second as well. You can use it to stop the Yeep so the Purely can't do stuff. You can book all the Rescue Ace cards, the untargetable ones as well, so that now they don't have the traps live and they have to have an emergency access still to keep going. Or the one that revives. I don't remember which one. I think it's Rescue. Versus Lab, it's pretty bad. And versus Chimera, it's not great, but at least versus Chimera, it doesn't lose to Quaddle and it still turns off the Sword Knight. While the books aren't perfect, I think this one is definitely better than Book of Moon by a pretty big margin. Moon isn't as good going first. I think this is better going first, and it's better going second. I think this is just a card I want to include in pretty much every deck list, which feels weird to say. I think this card is just insane right now. Next up is Enemy Controller. So I think this card is still really strong in Kashtira, and we haven't been seeing enough of it. I think being able to dodge book effects, steal their threat, which then requires an answer, or dodge effect negators, to force Zeus lines through, or to steal their XYZ to make a Zeus, I'll make it very good in Kashtira. I think it's good versus the Unchained field. If you summon something like a Fenrir, and you get into like the Caesar, and they go effect to pop, you can econ, so it turns off the pop, you take the Caesar, and the Caesar then negates the rage. If they go rage effect, you can turn off the rage, target the Caesar, and they have to use the escape to pop the Caesar and the rage, which is pretty much eating everything at once. Yes, you have to commit one monster into it, but it's fine. I really like this card in Kashtira, but it's limited to decks that can put up those extra bodies and still play through it. Similar to Lava Golem, you want to pretty much not need your normal summon that much for this card to be good, but I do like it a lot. And then you can cash if you're playing a lot of these type of cards. You even fit stuff like Deus Ex Machina in your deck, and like Downer Magician to really take advantage. But yeah, I think this card is good. I'm not playing it right now because I don't know if Unchained can really support the tribute, but I think if you can play this comfortably in your deck, you should. I like this card a lot, and obviously going first, it's still a defensive tool. You can't have your opponent say, "Ha, you start," and then you get stuck with a bunch of talents in your hand. That's always a risk when you play a lot of side cards that just steal. Next up is Eradicator Epidemic Virus. I think with Unchained and Rescue Ace, you're seeing less and less spells in the format, less runic cards. Eradicator has gotten worse. I think this card is just average. I think searching it turn 1 is not even a game over in many scenarios, unless you're like playing cash. Like Purely can still play fine through it most of the time. And I just think this card is not fantastic. Obviously, you'll still play it in the right decks, but even in those decks, I think it has been underperforming, and there's even like a world where you start siding it. I don't know if that's already happened with Labyrinthus, but I think this card is overrated. Next up is XYZ Encore. I think this card is pretty strong. This card is very matchup dependent, so I would not put it in any main decks, like a lot of the other cards I've been mentioning. But it is pretty good against several matchups. You get good coverage, and it does a lot in those matchups. You can hit a Rise Heart, and you can hit the Purely cards. Covering those two matchups is really good. But where I like this a lot is on the perspective of a Unchained player, because you get to do those two things as well. But it also answers a Dweller before they have a chance to Dweller you. And that's a big concern if you are playing the Unchained deck. In other decks, though, I think oftentimes other pieces of removal may be better. Although those can still definitely get value as a removal versus the Pearly and Kashtira cards. My one hesitation with it is if we still aren't seeing Rescue Ace players using Dweller, are you deciding this in versus the Rescue Ace player as an Unchained duelist? And obviously, if they don't Dweller you this in your hand, you just feel a bit like an idiot. And that's not something you ever really want to do. You want your cards to be live. And that's the skepticism that I still have. Although I feel like this card could become stronger and stronger as the format gets more solved. And you can also use it on Caesar, but I don't know if I'd ever really want to put this in versus that matchup. Next up, we got the Psy-Frame Epsilon. So this is negating trap cards. It was popular to stop Eradicator stuff and D-Barrier. Anti-Spell even. I think this card is a gimmick and it's not worth. I'm not going to overly explain it. I just think it's incredibly situational. And you're pretty much saying I can deal with the rest of the engine by itself. That's a big ask. Unless it's versus Labyrinth, in which case I guess this deals with the engine. That's one matchup, and there's just other cards that do it better without having a driver in your deck. Next up, we got Evenly Matched. I think Evenly Matched is pretty strong right now. I think, obviously, I wouldn't main it just because going first, you don't want to just get blown up by too much of their going second cards, and you need to make sure you have some defensive tools of your own. But I think siding it for almost any position you go second is good because it has strong matchup spread. Like it's solid versus Labyrinth. It's good versus the Chimera deck. It is solid versus Unchained. It's pretty bad versus Purely, and it's not great versus Cash. But it is still a deck that it is still a card I do like. I think if you want more for Cash, you put in Stormer Duster typically over this. And if it's the if you want more to deal with Chimera, you'd rather have Evenlies. Both are still fine in each of the matchups, and they can still get great value. But I think just seeing how there's so little negation in the format right now, these type of cards that trade heavily for value, while also dealing with their interruptions, are exactly where you want to be going second in many positions. And yeah, this is a card I have been liking. If we start seeing the Unchained board go for Griffin stuff a lot more as well, this is just better. And I think the Caesar one gives better follow-up than the Evenly, or than the Griffin board, and that means Evenly's not as good into it. But I digress. Card is good. I don't know much else to say. Next up is Fenrir. So I've kind of given this card a little shit, saying it's not actually that good of a non-engine card. But as of right now, I actually have to disagree. I think this card is really good. I think you play into, when you go first with this card, it forces them to answer it. It's not great when decks can just naturally swing over it before committing to its effect. So that does happen sometimes still in the Kashmir, or when the DDD, or when the Unchained player uses the DDD package. But for the most part, this sticks, and then force them to at least trade a card for it while giving you a card in hand you can discard later, and keeps them off of their ability to kill you, which means if you set up good follow-up, you're in a good position. And then as for going second, it does decently into Breaking Field. I don't love it into Purely, and it's pretty bad versus Chimera. Versus Rescue Ace, it's fine if they don't Ibly you, which is a big if, but if they don't Ibly you, which isn't standard, it's good. It can make up for them flooding you a lot of times. It can deal with Anti-Spell. It can deal with pistols when you go first, which is a nice one. And I think it's just a pretty overall solid card. I don't like how if your deck plays into Nib and you summon this as your non-engine, you're kind of burning a card. Yes, it replaces itself into the Nib, but you're replacing itself with a card in hand that's not actually helping you. So if you didn't have the best hand to play through Nib anyways, the Fenrir is not helping you at all. So that kind of prevents you from putting it at the best, where I think it still has flaws, but there are many cases where this card is very strong. Playing into Cash fields and Unchained fields, it just feels like it forces out a good bit, and it can do so in other matchups as well. Even versus Lab, if your opponent's going to want to have to pay attention to it, otherwise they'll lose their Lovely. If they don't, then and if they do deal with it, then you just get to play the rest of your deck, kind of avoiding that interaction. Next up is Gamma. It is limited, so this card is not great. Some people have been playing this in Unchained. I mean, not Unchained, in Labyrinth. You've seen me play it with Ryan's deck list on Dueling Book before. I think this card is just ass. Like, the 1-for-1 with a brick and good card is not worth it. And I think Effect Negation is just not the best right now. I think this card is like great versus Rise Heart, but that's almost the extent of it. A lot of decks can just push through it relatively easily. You can hit like an Airlifter maybe, and this just goes hard, but it feels greedy, and there's just better options. Next up is Mourner. So the common trend here, again, we talked about how Effect Negation just isn't very good. I think as far as hand traps go, it still applies. Just negating an effect doesn't always do enough. In fact, it almost never does. Versus Kashtira, it has a chance to stop them, but even then, it's not that good. And versus Unchained, it won't really stop them. Versus Lab, it sucks. Versus Chimera, it's... Sometimes it hits the Baphomet, but like, it's not great. It sucks if they have the fusion spell to chain, or if they don't need the Baphomet to resolve. It doesn't matter either. And then obviously, once they have the Quaddle Engrave, it targets, so it doesn't even help there. I just think this card is, like, Effect Negation hand traps are just not what I want to do. It is not worth it. Yeah. Next up is Gozen Match. Gozen Match was a big one for the WCQ. Stevenson totally cited this as one of his reasons to play Exosister. One of the few decks that got to play Gozen Match, and Gozen was really good. I think this card is really good. Honestly, it's in the right deck or matchup because it's very, very specific decks that can play it, but it still functions very strong against Kashtira, and it's very strong against Unchained, and it is strong against Purely as well. Now, that doesn't mean these decks don't have outs to it. Obviously, Fenrir exists. The Unchained deck can crash, but if you can back this up with any sort of interruption and layers, then this is just great. So I still think this card is one of the better floodgates you can play, and going second, it's still functional as well, unlike Anti-Spell. So if you can play this, there is a good case to be playing Gozen. That being said, sometimes you still rather focus on cards that function entirely going second. Next up is the Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. I guess this is strong in the right deck or matchup, but I really, really like this card right now, so I'm going to put it as really good. Obviously, it's not for every matchup. It's really just for the Chimera deck and other Despia decks. So, you know what? I guess I'll put it here. It's really just the right matchup, but I think this card is really strong in that matchup. And I think, unlike Barrier, it's really good going first or second, as we're seeing a lot of players don't really have Link extra decks, and if they do, they're not super prepared for this. This card will just solo games by itself if you can force it through. Yes, they may Chimera your back row, but usually you can force out the Chimera stuff, or you can send multiple back row to conceal it. And once it's flipped up, it can be very hard for them to deal with. Most other decks can have ways around it, which is why it's good to use. But yeah, I think if you wanted a card like Barrier in your deck, but you didn't really care about Purely that much, you just wanted to deal with Chimera, this is just the better card. The advantage to this is Thrust. Next up is Herald of the Abyss. This is a card that I've been playing as a Thrust target, but I'm like not sure how I feel about it. It gives you the Thrust out against Purely, but if you have a lot of other outs to Purely, it almost feels futile and just a weird card in your deck. You can side it in with other matchups, like you're almost always tempted to, because the 1-for-1 removal doesn't seem bad, but I can't really decide how I feel about this. This is a card I'm very much on the fence of taking out of my side deck. I maybe bait just to have it in my deck. Like, yeah, it makes me feel safe with the Purely coverage to have just the one of, but it just feels like it always has less than another card that could have been. So, it's like in the middle here, but I'm going to lean to just average right now. This very much could be in your deck, and if you have a weak spot versus Purely and you're playing Thrusts, then sure, but it's just kind of been underperforming for me, so my opinion of it has been not that good. Next up for the really good, I think this one's really high up there, is Duster. I think what holds it off from being the best is the inability to be effective when you go first, but a lot of the times there are back row disruptions right now, so this clears for disruption and for value. And when a card clears both at the same time, that's when it tends to be pretty good. There's not much negation to prevent it from coming down, and that's what leading me to say cards like this and Evenly are just incredibly strong. And I just want to say the same regard, Storm is the same. In fact, it's probably better because sometimes hitting like the monsters is actually like a thing you could do. Hitting Griffin plus Muckracker is fine, and hitting Caesar plus Rage is fine as well. Sometimes put the cash cards in attack, and you can do that as well, although I don't recommend that, because they should never be an attack, on turn 1 at least. But I think this is typically better. Of course, there's this small asterisk of if you have cards on the field, like a Nibiru, a Bestial, or an Ibli, then Duster is better, but I think both these cards are fantastic right now, and I would like to either play this, or maybe even both if you can fit it in your side decks at events. But the main thing holding it back is going first, and you want to make sure you can still allow to go first. I don't like blinding second because if people know, they'll make you go first and you're just kind of screwed. Yeah. Next up is Ibli. This is like one of the leads for if your deck can use it, it's the best. I really think Rescue should be doing this because their biggest weaknesses tend to be cards like this and this. So this being a flood and turning off these cards is really important. And what's nice as well is that not enough decks can use this card that people are forced to play Lingaribo. So they kind of just are taking the risk that it's not that common and Rescue Ace is not that popular. And then they just don't play Lingaribo and so they can focus on the rest of their deck instead, making this a relatively big threat that I'm concerned about. Now, against the Unchained deck, you do play Tribute Summons. You have 10 that you can kind of tribute over. You got the Abomination's Prison, and then the 4 level 6s, and then counting Prosperity, but obviously that's an asterisk again. Rikea can kind of deal with it as well, because you summon it, you can either link or pop it. If they go target to destroy it, like on summon, with the trap that pops, you chain Rikea, target the Ibli, and like you're fine. It's not really fine, and on all these situations, winning the normal for a lackluster interaction is not desirable. But obviously, it's not nearly as like catastrophic as versus Cash, where the Ibli's just sitting there and you're like, great. But I think the card is very good if you can play it. So Sprite and Rescue deck should be taking advantage of the fact that people are ill prepared for it. Next up is Impermanence. I'm gonna put this card in Not Worth It. I'm a strong advocate for against Imperm. I'm not a fan of hand traps anyways, but I think again, Effect Negator hand traps are just bad at the current moment. They don't really trade well into anything. The best thing is like Cash and Purely, but if they have Street, then like it just does nothing. And half the time versus Cash, they can just extend through Imperm anyways. It's like trying to brick them like you do with Ash, but worse. So definitely not a fan of Imperm. Yes, this one is the best out of all the Effect Negators, because if you go second, you can just use it as a 6 as like a Chalice. But again, like those Effect Negations just don't trade that favorably. Like, yeah, you can turn off a Griffin, but like, or like a Caesar or an Arise Heart, but there's still so much more to deal with. And it's just, there's so many other cards that trade better and are better in other spots. As going first as an interrupt, it just pales in comparison to the books. I think it's just not worth it. And I'm going to skip ahead here with Valor. I think it's just the same. It has the same flaws, and it keeps it from being something that's good. These are obviously even worse because they play into Talents, which is very popular right now. Yeah. Judgment, this is going to be a quick one. People like this is going first card very often. I think this card is just ass. It stops one card, trades on for one. And unless you're really like trying to stop cards like this, it just never actually trades. Like in a favorable way. And half your life means it's way easier for them to pressure you a lot of the time as well. One of the first things you learn is that life points don't matter, but they kind of do matter because it makes it way easier for your disruptions to be forced if you don't have the life points to protect yourself or to absorb a few hits. I think if you want going first cards post side, there's just infinitely better options. Then obviously it sucks going second, so you would never main deck it. Yeah, Judgment's ass. I think Kaiju's fall in a very similar vein here, or I guess to Judgment. In the almost opposite regard, they're terrible going first, so you never really want to main deck it. And when you go second, there's just better stuff to do. Like, if you want to hit an Arise Heart, the spells, their single target removal are better. Even Herald of the Abyss is better, versus purely Kurikara is better, Herald of the Abyss is better, or just booking it before it gets to the Noir is better. So why the hell would I want Kaiju? Versus Unchained, obviously, you'd rather have Lava Golem as well. Or Sphere Mode in certain scenarios, but it's unlikely. This card is just bad. I don't think I'd want to play Kaiju now. The biggest appeal to play Kaijus would be Slumber. But again, I don't think Dark Hole is that good either right now. So that kind of leaves me thinking Kaijus are not the wave. Kurikara is very similar. I don't think it trades for enough of the disruption or value for it to really be like the Storm or Duster. I don't think it's as good in enough matchups. I think versus Unchained, obviously, it's like not great. In fact, I wouldn't set it in. Versus Purely, it's good. Against Noir, they almost always draw, but it can be played around. At least against Purely, it does put up 3k body, so you can kill them a lot easier. Versus Cash, they often still get value out of it. You'd almost rather have a Talents than this, but it's still fine. What I also don't like about it, though, is it's It locks you out of summoning cash monsters because you fill in your field. So it doesn't work in that deck. It doesn't work really in Unchained either because half the time you're locked into Fiends. I know those are 2 specific decks, but that's 2 decks automatically where you can't really use it. And I just think it's not that good. I think it's being carried by, it does perform pretty well against Purely. But other than that, I think this card is pretty bad, just in a general like sense. And I wouldn't play this card a lot of the time. I really only play it if you really want something for Purely. Next up is Lance. I think this card is pretty underrated right now. But with the huge popularity of book cards, of the stealing cards, having Lance is fantastic. It helps you play through Disruption as well, because we talked about how a lot of Disruption is in the form of spells and traps. Because beyond those books, there also exists the Rescue Ace traps and the Unchained trap. All of which you want the Lance to kind of push through. It obviously is not good versus Chimera. Even if you can target one of their monsters, they can't fuse with it. When they go Chimera Fusion, Quaddle should just negate Lance if it even poses a threat. So that it's not going to be good in that matchup. But I think in matchup where you can use this card, it's pretty good. You can use it offensively as well against Purely to stop Yeep, which is just dumb, but it's free. So I think if you are weak to books and stealing type cards, like specifically Cash is weak to those, very, very weak to those. And you can afford to use it, so Purely can't always, because you can't actually use this when they chain book. And in those cases, I think it is worth running this card. I think it does trade favorably just in many scenarios. Yes, it doesn't always combat the problem at hand. I think it does enough of the time that it is worth playing. I want you to explore playing this card in Rescue Ace. I think it could be a fine card as well. Obviously not as weak to the steal stuff, but the books can be very annoying. So I did want to try it out. Next up is Lava Golem. I think this is also a strong in the right decker matchup. I think what's holding this back is a lot of decks do require the normal summon and you don't want to give it up. But if you can afford to give up your normal summon, like in Cash or Purely, this card is just good. Against Unchained, you clear the field, and now they're forced to use the both traps in conjunction to really start playing, or now they need 2-card combos to interrupt, and the level of interruption does go down pretty drastically. So I think Lava Golem just trades really well into the field, and while it doesn't get you all the way there into playing against the field, it does a lot and makes it hard to push past it. On decks you can use it, the card is great. Next up is Skullmeister. I hate this card, but I think it is probably better than it has been in a while, just because of Unchained. It's really just for Unchained, and sometimes the Skullmeister can end their turn, but it doesn't happen enough for me to think this is reliable. If you want to go for the, what I don't advise, strategy of hand-trapping your opponent to death, this is a way to kind of get you closer against Unchained. Being said, his matchup spread is not good. It would pretty much just be for Unchained, and I think there are cards that just do it better. I'd rather play Bestials at that point even, but yeah. Next up is Marionette Might. This one may be surprising, so I'm going to throw the text up in here, or up here on screen again. Just get a mistaken arrest. Use Electric Virus and Pop a Plant, but for fiends and zombies, you send it to the grave and you steal a fiend or zombie. And exchange a heart against Unchained. It is very specific for a matchup, but I think it is really good in the matchup it's good in. Stealing the Griffin, meaning you have full control over the zones, means that's not a problem anymore. Or stealing the Caesar is great because now they need to pop it, otherwise they lose their own interrupts. And that trades for a lot of cards for them. And then, unlike something like Talents, you draw multiples, you can use multiples. It's also a monster, so it's not weak to Eradicator or Anti-Spell Fragrance. And I just think it is absolutely worth playing in the deck if you are wanting something for the mirror match. I myself, as I lead into Vancouver, am probably playing either Marionette Might or Druid Swarm or both in my side deck as a way to combat the Unchained mirror match. Yeah, I really like this card. Obviously, it does not have matchup spread. It's extremely targeted, but that's fine. I guess you can put this in versus Labyrinth. I haven't even thought about that, but I probably would, just because stealing a Fiend is good. It takes them, gives it rid of a body off field, so it removes their follow-up, and then it also lets you make Yama. Sure. Oh, and you can, if you steal Lovely, you can reset an Unchained Trap, which is pretty funny. Book of Moon. This is a card I've been saying is really good for a really long time right now. However, I think it has kind of fallen off a bit. I think when you go first with it, it is still okay, but it is no longer as insane. I think Eclipse does more because you can let them go wide and then do this, where this is more single target removal, and your cards typically, like in Cash or Purely or Unchained or Rescue Ace, are already single target. So more single target gives them more of an ability to play around it, makes it worse. And then going second, it obviously also does less than this. Sometimes it trades the same, like into a single Arise Heart, it's fine. Obviously not into like a Shang field. If it's into the Unchained Caesar field, they do the same thing, which I guess is fine. I think this card is as strong as it gets as far as average, but I'm leaning to maybe taking it out of my deck for the Unchained. I think it has gotten weaker than it has been for a while. So I think it may be time to start moving this out. And obviously its matchup spread is getting worse, as it's not that good versus Unchained. It's pretty bad at going first. It's not good versus Lab, which has been there for a while. Versus Rescue Ace, it's not good going second. It's fine going first, though. And versus Chimera, it's pretty bad. It targets, so you can't even like try Force Off removal because you trigger the Quaddle. And Quaddle is like a card I don't want to ever trigger because you realistically should be able to break the field without ever forcing it. Giving them the free value off the Quaddle just feels minus. Next up is Nibiru, a card I'm very skeptical about, but I've ultimately decided is really good. I think it is possible to put in the main deck. It may catch people by surprise if you put it in the main deck. It seems with Unchained's matchup spread, or sorry, with Cash's matchup spread getting worse, they are more inclined to do greedy plays, and then you can punch them with Nibiru. Obviously, if Nibiru starts seeing more and more and more play, that'll stop happening. For the time being, Nibiru seems good at position versus there. Versus Unchained, it is not insane, but it's still a good card. When you compare it with other stuff, it can get you across the line to beating them, but rarely does it ever function as a solo way to beat them. Whereas Rescue Ace, I think it's pretty good. Rescue Ace can play around it most of the time. They'll feel their field is inadequate or too weak to other cards. They'll have to extend past that into other sort of combos. It could be a Dweller, it could be an Ibly, it could be the Cyber stuff, all of which, though, will suffer a devastating fate to Nibiru. Obviously, its matchup spread isn't perfect. It's not good versus Labyrinth, it's not good versus Chimera, and it's not good versus Purely. But you're never going to find something that's entirely good, and that's also what keeps it off of being the best. I do think what's really cool about this card is thinking of it in the context of it's like Torrential when you go first, makes it incredibly strong as a going first card as well. And I think that's something people may overlook, where it can be just solid going second, but really good going first. They really make it a fine tech choice, if not on the main, on the side. It is a card I'm considering maining for Vancouver at this point in time, because it may catch people off guard, and then going first, it's just great. And if everyone's playing a bunch of steel cards, then having something to increase my going first sounds ideal to me, at least. Next up is Offering to the Doom. It's a card I have seen in some people's tech lists act as a 7th through 9th book, because you can pop the Arise Heart, you can pop whatever they target with Yeep, and you can pop just random stuff. I don't like, however, is it's worse into Unchained because they can trigger Yama. So if they're popping Griffin, they can get it back. Muckracker can protect it as well. The Caesar would still trigger immediately there. You can't just maybe steal it later with Talents, which is a nice setup. And some people say you can use this to pop your own Unchained cards, but I think that is a terrible trade. And you're almost never going to do that as an actual play starter. But it's not like Tier where then you get Kit and you really start rolling. You summon her from deck, but what are you summoning with the one summon that actually gets there? You still have to have another Fiend on field for it to be meaningful. I think that just never happens. I think this card is not worth it, and it's just pure bait right now. Next up is Ghost Ogre. I don't know why I even put this here. This card is just pure bait. It is no good matchups. What are you ogring? Purely was the one that it promised to have a decent matchup against, but a Happy Memory protecting it means it's very hit or miss. Yeah, this card just sucks. Banquet Tops. Right now, we talked about how these are great because they trade for value and clear interrupts. This isn't really doing that. It can maybe 2 for 1, but I think it does so a lot worse than these cards. You're never really going to put all of those in once. I think this card is just not worth it. There's almost always better alternatives. It is not Banquet Tops' time to shine. Next up, we got Phantasmate. This is one that's been not played for a while now. This card has been pretty bad for a while because Link decks just suck. The exception was Sprite, but Sprite Gigantic locks you. However, with Unchained and Rescue Ace, I think this card is actually pretty good versus both of them. And I'm going to put it here even. I think this card is good, especially if you're filling it up with a bunch of just generically good non-engine cards. Like if the entire design of your setup has to have nothing extremely targeted, but a bunch of cards you can use versus everything, being able to sculpt your hand while also stopping targeting effects and the extra body get you the distance against both those matchups. I think this is absolutely something to look out for. That being said, his matchup spread is still not the best. Just those new 2 decks that are really good against. It's not good against Chimera. It's not good against Lab. It's not good against Cash. And it's not good against Purely. It's not like something we'll ever see in the main deck, or at least not in this current meta. But it's something to keep an eye on, as something that is now actually a lot better than it seems. Next up is Ghost Reaper. Yeah, this card just kind of sucks. I don't know, man. You can hit Noir, and that can be devastating, but that's really targeting for Purely. But then if you go first, they can just do other stuff as a going second deck, and then the Reaper is just not good. You'd rather have like something that does that is better in both situations. Against Cash, hitting a Rise is not even that good. Unchained Yama, I guess, it's not that good. This really doesn't solo anything besides Purely, and there's just better cards to do that. So it's not worth it. Like, I guess it's not worth it. Just don't play it. Next up is Retaliating Sea. This one is pretty solid right now, actually. I don't think it's that bad. However, I think it is also a little overrated. I don't know if that's weird to say. It may not be on people's radar at all, and I'm not sure how good of a read I have on if people are talking about it. But I think it's fine versus Purely, and more decks can play now than they could before. Also good versus Chimera because it gets the Chimera Fusion banished. But it's just okay. It's not floating. Obviously, not every deck can use it. Primarily, Cash can't use it. You need to be able to link it off like right away as well. I don't love it in Purely either, but I think Unchained can use it just fine. And I think Rescue Ace can use it pretty well because it's a body for you to link with, and you don't care about the macro that much. It's a card to consider, and it has merits, but I do think it is not enough matchup spread to ever main deck it, and I don't know if it's ever good enough to actually side deck. But I have more faith in it than a lot of the other cards that are in the not worth it section right now. All right, we're getting there, I promise, guys. I know this has been a long video. If this is too long, let me know, but I wasn't sure how to fit in this many staple cards, and I didn't want to miss them all either. So I hope you understand if I missed something. I really tried to be thorough, but yeah. Anyways, pressing forward. Rivalry of the Warlords. How is this card right now? Versus Kashtira, it is not great. Doing it into an Arise Heart, they can banish it, and it's fine. Versus Purely, it sucks. Versus Unchained, it sucks. Versus Rescue Ace, it can sometimes be meaningful, but not always. Versus Labyrinth, it's unplayable. And Chimera, it's probably okay, but they can probably like tribute set and then Chimera fusion the way out of it like enough at the time that it's not great. I think this card's matchup spread is never worth it. And for the few matchups it is good against, there's just cards that do the same thing better. So you'd never main deck it, and if you are siding it, you'd side other cards instead. Next up is D-Shifter. This is still just the best card if you can play it. Yeah, I know not every deck can play it. It probably shouldn't be in the best, but if you can play it, this card is just so effing good. It is so upsetting when it's used against me. From any deck's perspective besides Cash, I guess. Rescue Ace, they can play it, but it's like, it's still kind of, even from their perspective, it gets worse. They can't summon Prevention, they can't summon Turbulence from the hand, so their plays get worse. They're less consistent, and they also can't do anything as flashy. The only like time this actually sucks is against like Cash, but it's so good that it's part of what keeps Cash as the best deck. This card is just nuts. Yeah. Next up is Skill Drain. This card is pretty good. Obviously it's weird with the prevalence of these back removals. I try and avoid Floodgates, so this is one's always going to be a bit iffy. It's kind of like on the par with Gozen match, but if you can play it, it's pretty good. Unchained can out it, but it's slow and it's not a great trade, but it's doable. Cash can also out it, but again, it's not great. Stuff like books are necessary to usually do it. But those decks do have big monsters, so you have to be careful that you can consistently still beat them. This is specifically from the perspective of like Labyrinth, I guess. But even in these decks, you can play Skill Drain like any Cash just to stop the smaller decks. Like it's good versus Rescue Ace, versus Chimera. Like they need multiple fusions going off at once to really out it. I just think Skill Drain is like the only effect negator that actually like does something good enough. But sometimes it just still may not be enough. I don't know, it's weird. This is probably the lowest low of Hero with Phantasme, of the strong in the right decker matchup. But I think if you do want an effect negator, this is the best one. Obviously, this one stops Noir as well, which is useful. And then being permanent is good. Yeah. Anyways, moving on. Sphere mode, 3 monsters in the field is not that common for turn 1s nowadays. Cash can sometimes do it. Unchained can sometimes do it. But it's not often enough that I ever want to put this in. There's not really a spot in the meta for Sphere mode. More followers. Super Polymerization. This is a card I'm seeing in a couple side decks right now, and I'm not really sure why. The Chimera deck doesn't really have a good Super Poly target. Unchained, you can't Super Poly really anything, unless they leave up for KO plus Caesar. Purely, you really can't Super Poly either. Cash, you need to have your own Dark to Poly with your Rise Heart, which is a 3-for-1, not a great trade. So this card's not very good. The reason I played was for Sprite decks before, like Dragon decks, both of which are falling off popularity, making this worse. It's good versus Rescue Ace, so it's like really for one of those matchups. But even then, I think there's probably just better stuff you can play. I don't think it's like actually terrible, but I probably would move it out of main decks right now and into side decks. And it has some utility, even in the matchups where it's not great against, but it's never going to be like that good. It was definitely better last format. Next up is Summon Limit. Yet another effing floodgate that should not be legal, but it is. Compared to the other ones, Summon Limit probably... How do I feel about Summon Limit? That's a good question. I haven't thought about this. I hadn't considered it. I think if I was comparing against Deck Lockdown, I'd rather have Deck Lockdown. I feel like there is enough of the time they can push through this that maybe this isn't worth it. I'm going to put it average with the anti-spell. I think this can definitely steal games, but I'm just not sure if I want more floodgates to play into these. And I think both can steal games, but there are many hands that maybe get past them too often for me to really be comfortable with this. I don't know. I'm just going to finish off the floodgates here. There can be only one. I think this is probably like the best of the floodgates. Versus Cash, it can be relatively strong. It's not game ending, but it can be annoying for them. Versus Unchained, it's pretty good. Rescue Ace is not good against. Labyrinth, it can be annoying for them, but you know that it can also function without the monsters. Against the Chimera deck, this is the deck you'd play it in, so it's fine. And what's the last deck? Purely. It's good against Purely. So I think if you can play the Chameleon one, there's a very strong case to be made to play it. It's probably one of the strongest floodgates you can play that keep monsters off the field. And it's obviously like fine going second on like stuff like Summon Limit. So absolutely worth playing if you can. Last two are Talents and Rust. So I think Talents is a really good card right now. Again, with no effect negation, this is one of the biggest cards that if you can't negate has a strong punish. However, it can be played around. There are enough disruptions through the back row that sometimes you can avoid using a monster effect to avoid getting punished by Talents. That being said, unlike other cards that are insane going second, this does have game when it goes first because it turns off or makes Ash and Nib way worse against you and any deck you're playing, or any other hand traps as well. The Talents is not fantastic going first, but it still does have a job and can do something, unlike the other cards. Stealing right now is very good because oftentimes you steal a disruption, so it's a very, very favorable trade, or sets up a Zeus. And it's the same reason Change of Heart was good. Talents is good. Non-targeting is a huge factor as well. Versus Kashtira, this is better than Change of Heart because it's so easy to turn on, and because it doesn't target, so you can threaten anything. Insane versus Kashtira. However, it's not as good going first as some other cards, and I think sometimes the draw 2 or the rip your hand or the steal doesn't always do enough. Its lack utility, I think, ultimately leaves it a little bit off of the absolute best cards. But I think it is one of the highest rated really good cards here. But there's all of it in here because this is kind of the if. This is like the gamble. But yes, Rust I think is probably one of the best cards in the format because it gets you all these cards that are really good, and then cards that are good in specific matchups as well, like these. Or even Herald of the Abyss. I think Rust is just super strong. And maybe this is my bias as an Unchained player right now talking as well, because it gets Unchained traps. and getting engine, I just think this card is nuts. It can also search stuff like terraforming, which gets you planet in cash, so it helps you get engine in that case, where this may not always help you to crack the field. And then you can get Rhoda or Prosp and like Rescue Ace or 1-for-1 even, if you want to do that as an extension. So I think like between those decks, Thrust is just really strong. I think while it may not be the best in literally every deck, I think it is incredibly strong in so many decks, and it's good in so many matchups that I think it is one of the best cards in the meta. And it's weird because I didn't like this card for a while, and I think as a card in certain metas, this card isn't that great. But the way it stands, this card is phenomenal. Playing it at Brazil, I cited it out, I think 0 times, and that kind of shows you when a card is really good. You're never citing it out. That's good. And yes, I did cite out Talon sometimes. Rust I didn't, because just setting a trap Unchained was good enough, or setting D-Barrier or Daruma Cannon in the right matchup. That's it, guys. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's been a really long video, but I appreciate all of you who took the time to watch. Again, if there's anything I missed, any opinions you think I made a mistake on, feel free to let me know. The biggest thing about growing as a player is being open to others' thoughts. That includes me being open to your guys' thoughts as well. So, again, feel free. Feedback is appreciated. And then also not just in regards to the cards, but the video itself. If this is the type of video you want to see, great. If I could have done something a little better, like if you wanted it longer, which I can't imagine you want, let me know. Shorter, I guess I can try trim some of the fat next time. But yes, that's it, guys, for now. And I'll see you all next time. Peace.